The luxury of the Dallas mansion was an opulent insult to Isabella's grief, a vast monument of marble and glass where the only constant sound was her daughter's persistent, piercing cry. The wealth accumulated by her late husband seemed to become a barrier, isolating her from any genuine comfort or practical assistance in that moment of profound grief and despair. Emily, only 6 months old, represented not continuity, but a crushing weight of responsibility that Isabella felt she had no strength to carry. The gigantic, perfectly decorated rooms seemed to swallow Isabella, leaving her alone with the deafening sound of her own inadequacy. She wondered if all that wealth was worth the emptiness she felt as she cradled the baby who seemed to reject her touch. The mansion was, in effect, an echo chamber for her failure as a mother. Isabella, a premature widow, too beautiful to be so broken, spent her nights awake, exhausted and frightened. Emily's crib was made of Italian wood, but the child cried as if on stones, rejecting all the material comforts that a life of luxury offered. Isabella tried everything: calming teas, white noise, expensive therapists, and even late-night car trips, in the vain hope of calming her daughter. Her pale skin and deep, dark circles were silent witnesses to a battle she was losing to a defenseless baby. The contrast between her life of privilege and her emotional misery was stark and unbearable. She felt the pressure from her friends and mother-in-law, who looked at her with pity and silent judgment. The baby cried for something Isabella lacked, perhaps her father's strength, perhaps a patience worn thin by grief, or perhaps simply a connection that separated them by an inexplicable abyss. Isabella clung to the memory of her husband, trying to find in him the answer to her daughter's stillness, but she found only more pain. Each tear from Emily was a pin driven into Isabella's conviction that she was an inadequate mother, incapable of fulfilling the role imposed on her by the tragedy. Specialists visited her weekly, but their diagnoses were cold and clinical, treating Emily as a problem to be solved, not a being to be loved. The silence in the house when it came was merely the tense interval before the next crying fit. The living room, with its modern art, was a sanctuary of impeccable design, but utterly devoid of life and human warmth. Emily was fed by trained nurses, but she regurgitated half of her bottles as if her small body rejected the impersonal nourishment. The renowned pediatrician who treated Dallas's elite had suggested that Emily might have a sensory disorder, a veiled sentence that echoed in Isabella's mind. "Your daughter is broken." This cold, inhuman judgment only deepened Isabella's despair, making her question her own worth and sanity. She sat beside the crib, praying for a miracle or an uninterrupted night's sleep. Loneliness was the only permanent guest. The expensive toys, piled in a corner, remained untouched, colorful, and ironic, observing the family's silent drama. Isabella knew she needed help, but feared that anyone hired would confirm her worst suspicions about herself. She called the domestic services agency with a choked voice, asking for someone discreet and efficient, unaware that she was about to summon fate itself into her living room. The announcement that a new maid was on the way brought a mixture of relief and dread to the widow, fearing the interference of a stranger in her carefully contained chaos. She wasn't looking for a surrogate mother, but rather a quick, professional solution to an intractable problem. Her husband's absence was a physical hole in the house, and Emily seemed to feel it with a frightening sensitivity, as if mourning a grief that encompassed them all. Isabella tried to convince herself it was just colic or reflux, or any medical diagnosis that could excuse her failure to soothe her daughter. She remembered the couple's plans, the joy with which they had decorated the room, the promise of a happy family life, all now crushed under the weight of fate. The emotional void was Emily's greatest inheritance, and Isabella didn't know how to fill it, not even with all her fragile love. She desperately wished the new maid would bring with her not only the ability to clean, but also a kind of magic. The image of the twisted car and the blaring siren of that January night burned into Isabella's retina, a brutal memory that luxury could not erase. Grief for her husband was a constant wave that drowned her, leaving her breathless and, worse, unable to offer emotional oxygen to the small life he had left behind. She endlessly relived the last foolish conversation, the last hurried "I love you," in an endless self-flagellation, searching for a mistake that could undo the irrefutable. The pain was so dense that it hung over her like a cloud, preventing her from seeing her daughter clearly, only as the last promise of a lost love. The weight of her husband's absence was the burden she carried, and Emily's crying was the incessant soundtrack to that burden. Isabella tried to love Emily, tried to feel the torrent of affection all mothers described, but the pain of grief was an impenetrable filter. Her connection to her daughter felt severed, an invisible thread broken by the tragedy that had left her alone and unprepared for motherhood. The baby was a constant reminder of what she had lost, a tiny being who demanded energy she no longer had, drained by lack and guilt. She saw herself as a shell, functioning only on automatic, fulfilling the essential tasks of feeding and diapering, but empty of soul and patience. The months dragged on in a tedious and painful routine. Specialists came and went, all tacitly agreeing that Emily was a difficult case, a baby who resisted comfort, diagnosed with extreme irritability. The word broken was the therapist's euphemism for Emily's inability to soothe herself, a clinical definition that hurt more than any direct accusation. Isabella's grief was treated as the cause, her mother's inability to provide reassurance. But the verdict was harsh. The baby was suffering the consequences of her mother's emotional fragility. Isabella then felt even more guilty, realizing that her pain was literally harming her daughter. She remembered the first few weeks when she tried to breastfeed Emily, an experience that turned into a nightmare of frustration and crying. Isabella's body wasn't producing enough milk, a biological flaw she interpreted as yet another sign of her maternal inadequacy. She surrendered to bottles, but the emotional distance remained, turning feeding into a cold, mechanical ritual. The maternal bond, which should have been instinctive and fluid, was hardened by trauma and lack of sleep. She felt like a caregiving machine, lacking the tenderness necessary for love. Her husband's absence was evident in every detail, from the empty side of the bed to the banal decisions about their daughter's upbringing, all now falling on Isabella. She fantasized about his return, imagining him holding Emily with the same strength and trust he had in life, capable of restoring peace with a simple touch. This fantasy was a dangerous refuge, for it prevented her from accepting reality and moving forward with her daughter. The weight of his absence was the weight of forced loneliness, of untransferable responsibility. Isabella leafed through the photo albums, searching in her husband's smile for the strength to smile at Emily, but her attempts were forced, almost painful. Emily responded to the forced smile with renewed tears, as if Isabella's falseness were more disturbing than her explicit sadness. The baby was, in some mysterious way, a mirror of Isabella's soul, reflecting the chaos and pain her mother tried to hide beneath the facade of a composed widow. She was a child who demanded authenticity, and Isabella had none to give. Rosa Martinez arrived at the mansion under the bright Dallas sun, a small, firm figure that contrasted with the sterile sophistication of the surroundings, bringing with her the smell of wet earth and pure soap. She wore simple clothes and held a rebozo folded, a traditional Mexican shawl of colorful cotton. It looked like a slice of real life amidst the magazine-style decor. The maid, hastily hired by the agency, looked older than the 40 years listed on her resume, and her dark eyes held a quiet, long-suffering wisdom. Isabella received her with the formal coldness of someone hiring a luxury service, expecting nothing more than discreet competence. Rosa's first encounter with Emily was an accident contrived by fate, as Isabella tried unsuccessfully to calm the baby during yet another of her uncontrollable crying fits. Rosa, who was unpacking her few belongings, heard the distress and entered the room without asking permission, driven by an instinct older than the house rules. She approached the screaming child in her exhausted mother's arms and held out her hands, a gesture of silent, disarming offering. Isabella, at the limit of her sanity, handed over her daughter, a pure surrender of someone with nothing left to lose. The miracle began with the silence of crying, which ended abruptly when Rosa cradled Emily against her shoulder, wrapping her not with their rebozo, but with the aura of her strong presence. Rosa began to rock the baby with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, and then her low, deep voice filled the room. It was an old lullaby, Ananane Spanish about stars and mountains, a melody that spoke of roots and human warmth, something strange and deeply familiar. The melody was melancholic, but the effect was immediate and transformative. Emily stopped screaming, her tense body relaxing with a deep, inaudible sigh of relief, and her swollen blue eyes fixed on Rosa's gentle, dark face. The song seemed to penetrate Emily's soul, filling the void that money and therapy couldn't touch, as if that song were the nourishment she needed. Isabella's face, watching the scene from the doorway, contorted with a mixture of disbelief, shock, and a sharp stab of jealousy and admiration. The maid had accomplished what the most expensive doctors had failed to do in months of fruitless attempts. When the song ended, the mansion was completely silent for the first time since the accident, a silence so thick it was almost palpable, and only Emily's soft breathing could be heard. The baby had not only stopped crying, but was sound asleep, a peaceful sleep that seemed impossible for such a child. Rosa placed Emily in the crib with the delicacy of someone touching a piece of glass and covered her with the blanket, before leaving the room as discreetly as she had entered without making a fuss about her extraordinary feat. Isabella spent the rest of the day at the edge of the crib, watching Emily sleep, as if afraid that the slightest movement might break the spell cast by the unknown woman. She felt immense gratitude and, at the same time, painful humiliation, the certainty that the connection her daughter needed came from an unexpected and culturally distant source. The contrast between the richness of the house and the simplicity of the Mexican song was proof that love and security could not be bought, but only given with the soul. Emily's small smile as she slept was irrefutable proof that Rosa was the miracle she sought. The miracle of Emily's night's sleep brought a strange stillness to the mansion, but in Isabella's mind, the noise of distrust and doubt became deafening, a battle between reason and gratitude. The relief of seeing her daughter finally at peace was palpable, but the feeling that a stranger had achieved the impossible where she, her mother, had failed, was a slow and subtle poison. Isabella watched Rosa with an almost sickening intensity, trying to decipher the secret behind her slow movements and calm gaze, searching for a flaw that would justify her growing jealousy. Gratitude was a weight that made her feel indebted to the maid, and this bothered her deeply. The specialists, summoned again, brought with them cold academic reports that only served to fuel Isabella's distrust, translating Rosa's miracle into clinical terms of dependency. The therapist, a rigid, formal woman, warned Isabella about the risk of creating an unhealthy bond with the maid, using technical language to dehumanize the affection the baby felt. They argued that Emily was merely seeking a substitute attachment figure and that her crying stopped out of fear of absence, not love, a cruel argument that Isabella, in her desperation, almost accepted. The chorus of voices against Rosa seemed to echo Isabella's own insecurity. Isabella found herself torn between the logic of the reports and the irrefutable evidence of her own eyes. In Rosa's arms, Emily was a different child, smiling, relaxed, and responsive, a baby she had never known. Distrust was a defense mechanism, Isabella's way of protecting her role as a mother and avoiding the pain of admitting that the maid was more competent at loving her daughter. She tried to recreate Rosa's gestures, rocking Emily and singing lullabies in English, But the result was always the same: renewed crying and the need to call Rosa. This failure was a constant blow to her self-esteem. The doubt grew. Why could a stranger with little education and coming from such a different background calm her daughter where she, with all the resources in the world, failed miserably? Isabella began monitoring Rosa's interactions with Emily through the surveillance cameras, not for security reasons, but in the secret hope of catching the maid making a mistake, a slip-up that would free her from that painful gratitude. She sought proof that Rosa was merely a lucky employee, not a superior maternal figure. The moral dilemma consumed her. Pushing Rosa away meant returning Emily to the hell of crying and despair, risking her daughter's emotional well-being, but keeping her meant accepting defeat and public humiliation. Isabella tried to rationalize, telling herself that Rosa was merely a necessary tool, a temporary remedy, but Emily's smile on the maid's lap dismantled all her intellectual defenses. The child had made her instinctive choice, and the legal mother was being rejected. Isabella remembered her mother's warnings about the dangers of becoming attached to domestic servants, about the need to maintain boundaries and distance, and this cold advice now seemed to take on a new, cruel relevance. Social pressure and distrust of experts were powerful forces pushing her to fire Rosa and try to solve the Emily problem alone, even at the cost of her own sanity. She was trapped in her own culture, where wealth dictated value and instinct was ignored in favor of clinical coldness. The mansion's meeting room, usually used to close million-dollar deals, was transformed into an austere courtroom where Rosa's fate was being judged by reports, protocols, and cold voices, all in unison against Isabella's maternal instinct. The therapist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, stirred a case which detailed Emily's signs of pathological dependence on Rosa, using psychological jargon to mask a simple observation. The baby preferred the maid to her mother. Isabella listened, her heart sinking, feeling like the main culprit for having allowed this forbidden connection to flourish. The pressure to remove Rosa was overwhelming and came from all sides. From the doctors who feared losing the case of a child they considered troubled, from Isabella's mother-in-law who saw Rosa's presence as an affront to the family's dignity, and from Isabella's own mind, which yearned to reassert control. Dr. Reed insisted on the need to reinforce the primary maternal bond by removing the surrogate figure, a cruel euphemism for stripping Emily of her only source of peace. The speech was convincing and rational, but it failed to explain the genuine joy on the child's face. Isabella tried to argue on Rosa's behalf, mentioning her uninterrupted sleep and the weight Emily was finally gaining, but her words were drowned out by clinical authority and the fear of being seen as a negligent mother who outsourced her responsibilities. Guilt washed over her in suffocating waves. She felt like the worst mother of all for needing a stranger, a simple immigrant woman, to fulfill her own daughter's need for affection. This feeling of failure was the main driver that drove her to consider firing Rosa. The therapist issued a cold ultimatum. Either Rosa was removed immediately or the case would be considered at risk and escalated to social services. A veiled threat that hit Isabella with the force of a punch to the gut. The thought of losing Emily to the foster care system for not being able to love her the right way was a paralyzing terror that made her waver. She stared at the reports, searching in the printed words for a justification for what her heart refused to accept. Isabella knew that if she fired Rosa, she would have to face Emily's tears and despair again, but the pressure to conform to protocol and what was socially expected of a mother of that class was almost unbearable. She was forced to choose between her daughter's happiness and her own reputation as a competent and in-control mother. The voice of reason screamed, "Fire her!" But a deep whisper, her dormant maternal instinct, called out to Rosa. That night, as Isabella tried unsuccessfully to rock Emily, the baby's cries seemed more than pain. They seemed like a plea, a protest against the stupidity of the adult world that tried to separate her from her only source of comfort. Isabella wept silently, hugging her daughter who curled up against her chest but wouldn't calm down, feeling defeat in every tense muscle of her little body. She realized that Rosa's love was the only real thing in that ocean of falsehood and wealth, and that to fight it was to fight Emily's own happiness. The days became a succession of furtive observations, of stolen moments when Isabella spied on Rosa and Emily, searching for the key to the bond that excluded her. But what she found was a tenderness that disarmed and shocked her deeply. Rosa, sitting on the floor of the nursery, cradled Emily, who gripped the maid's finger with surprising strength, a grip that spoke of absolute trust and security. The baby not only tolerated Rosa, she lit up in her presence, like a flower opening at the first ray of sunlight. The contrast between the crying baby in her arms and the laughing baby in Rosa's lap was a cold stab to Isabella's heart. Isabella noticed the way Rosa spoke to Emily, not with the loud, forced tone she herself used, but with soft whispers in Spanish, telling stories of her homeland and the family she had left behind. The maid's voice was a sonorous caress that soothed the child, and Emily responded with babbles of pleasure, resting her head in Rosa's lap with a peace she never displayed with Isabella. The scene was a portrait of pure motherhood, devoid of protocol and expectations. What disturbed Isabella most, and what set off the first alarm bells in her mind, was the intensity of Rosa's gaze toward Emily. A gaze that went beyond professional duty, a gaze of silent possession, of profound recognition, of unconditional adoration. It was the same expression Isabella had seen in old photographs of her own mother, a look that could not be bought or faked. Rosa looked at the baby as if she were seeing her again, not knowing her, like a mother looks at her child returning from a long trip. This observation was the invisible thread that would connect her to the truth. Isabella tried to ignore the strange sensation, attributing it to her jealousy and emotional fragility. But Rosa's gaze was a testament to her reason. She began to pay attention to the small details. The birthmark on the back of Emily's neck. The way Rosa caressed that exact spot. The maid's hesitation as she stepped away from the child to begin her work. Everything indicated a familiarity that transcended the line between maid and employer. That afternoon, Isabella caught Rosa singing a new song, Nana, and the tears streamed silently down the maid's face as she rocked Emily in an almost mournful rhythm. But the expression on her face wasn't one of sadness, but of an old, resolved pain. A pain only a mother can feel. Isabella withdrew unseen, with the dark certainty that there was more than a simple bond between the two, sensing that the truth was hidden behind a door she dared not open. The house, once filled with tears, was now full of secrets. Isabella felt her heart ache with a new form of jealousy, the jealousy of someone who has the title of mother, but not the instinct, and of someone who feels robbed of a love they never had. She realized that Rosa wasn't just taking care of Emily, she was claiming it with every touch and every song. That mother's gaze, pure and unmistakable, was the hook that would pull her into a reality that would turn her life upside down. Isabella's dark certainty turned into a frantic obsession that drove her to rummage through her husband's belongings, searching for a rational answer to the anomaly Rosa represented in their lives, an urgent need to prove that the maid was nothing more than an employee. She rummaged through the home office untouched, opening locked drawers and deciphering passwords he'd left behind, delving into a secret world of finance and business she'd never understood. The scent of his perfume was still in the air, a ghost guiding her. It was in the back of a closet, behind a stack of old tax documents, that Isabella found the rusty, forgotten metal box with her husband's name scrawled in pen. Inside, there was more than just contracts and policies. There was a folder with letterhead bearing the name of an obscure Miami law firm and the title in bold letters. Adoption process. Unidentified minor. Isabella's lungs lost air, and the world of certainties her husband had built collapsed all at once. The documents were cold and clinical, but the truth they revealed was devastating. Emily was not their biological daughter. The couple had sought the baby after years of failed attempts to conceive, and her husband had orchestrated the adoption in secret, fearing that Isabella, emotionally fragile, would not accept a child that wasn't hers. He had hidden the truth under the guise of a fictitious pregnancy, forcing Isabella to fake a pregnancy that existed only in his mind and in the baggy clothes she wore. The shock of the lie was almost as great as the grief. Isabella read the details through bleary eyes, feeling her husband's betrayal like a physical pain, the sensation of having lived through a luxurious farce, where she was merely the protagonist of a play he had written. But the worst was yet to come, the detail that made her gasp. The waiver of maternal rights form, signed in simple, halting handwriting, bore a name she already knew all too well, Rosa Martinez. The world spun, and Isabella had to hold on to the mahogany table to keep from falling. The crumpled paper in her hand trembling, the maid's name confirming the madness that had tormented her for weeks. The woman who had entered her home to dust and do the laundry was her daughter's biological mother, the owner of the loving gaze that had disarmed and humiliated her. The miracle of Emily's calming down now had a biological and cultural explanation. She was responding to the scent, the voice, and the soul of the woman who had given her life. Isabella felt the cold rage of betrayal and the searing pain of truth merge, realizing that Rosa had entered her home unaware that she was entering her own daughter's house, a cruel irony worthy of tragedy. The pain of mourning for her husband was replaced by the pain of disillusionment, and the distrust she felt for Rosa transformed into an agonizing understanding. The secret in the papers was the trigger for a war that was about to explode. The confrontation wasn't an explosion of shouts and accusations, but a broken whisper in the center of the gourmet kitchen, a tense silence that only Isabella's weeping could break, clutching the crumpled paper with the printed truth she had discovered. Isabella called out hoarsely to Rosa, unsure whether anger, the pain of the lie, or compassion for the woman she was about to destroy were overwhelming her. Rosa, who was wiping the quartz countertop, turned and saw the paper, and the blood seemed to drain from her dark face. Rosa didn't try to deny it or run away. Her dark, deep eyes met Isabella's with a mutual pain, a resigned acceptance that spoke of years of silent suffering, and tears began to stream down her face. The waitress lowered her head and began speaking in Spanish mixed with halting English. Her voice choked with emotion but clear in her confession. She revealed the story of extreme poverty, the illness that had ravaged her after childbirth, and Isabella's husband, who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. Rosa confessed to signing the resignation at the hospital, pressured by debt, hunger, and the promise that the child would have a better life, far from the poverty that consumed her, truly believing she couldn't keep her alive. She said Isabella's husband had promised the baby would be well cared for and loved, and that she had made the ultimate motherly sacrifice, exchanging possession for the certainty of her daughter's comfort and safety. Her pain wasn't anger. It was an old, renewed mourning for a lost opportunity. Isabella listened to the story of poverty and sacrifice with a tight throat, realizing that the life of luxury she lived was built on another woman's pain, and that the wealth of her home was the price paid for Rosa's womb. Her anger at her husband's betrayal was diluted by the understanding of the pain of her biological mother, who had made an impossible choice. The two women, united by their love for Emily and the same man's betrayal, wept together in the kitchen. Rosa revealed that she never knew where her daughter had been taken, but that instinct had guided her to the Domestic Services Agency, and that the coincidence of being sent to that home was a divine sign, proof that God had forgiven her for her sacrifice and reunited her with her daughter. She told Isabella that, upon seeing Emily cry, she knew the baby needed her scent and touch, and that lullaby was the only language they shared. The confrontation ended in an awkward, meaningful embrace, where tears of shock, anger, and relief mingled, a moment of mutual recognition. Isabella felt a wave of relief at finally understanding Emily's cries, realizing that the baby wasn't broken, but incomplete, missing her birth mother. The truth was a violent shock, but also a liberation, the end of the farce and the beginning of a new, uncertain journey. The brief moment of togetherness in the kitchen was brutally interrupted when Dr. Evelyn Reed, the strict therapist, discovered the truth through one of Isabella's assistants, who had overheard fragments of the conversation. Dr. Reed's reaction was immediate and formal. She reported the case to the appropriate authorities, accusing Isabella of gross negligence for concealing the truth and Rosa of kidnapping and manipulation of a minor. The external threat was now real and institutional. The atmosphere in the mansion transformed into a cold war, with Rosa and Isabella's every move monitored and judged by unseen eyes, and tension hung over them like a sword of Damocles. The law, blind to emotion and instinct, saw the situation only in terms of signed documents, broken contracts, and violations of adoption laws, completely ignoring the happiness and peace Emily had finally found. Isabella's wealth, which was supposed to protect her, now exposed her to public and legal scrutiny. Isabella, overcome with panic and rage, acted like a wounded lioness, defending Rosa and Emily against the cold accusations of Dr. Reed and the officers already asking questions over the phone. She realized that, while Rosa was the biological mother, they were now united in their goal of protecting the child from the system that threatened them, and that the title of legal mother no longer mattered. The accusations of risking losing Emily to foster care were the terror that united them. Isabella's lawyer, a cynical man accustomed to financial disputes, tried to convince her to incriminate Rosa, use the law to her advantage, and retain possession of her daughter. But Isabella vehemently rejected the idea, feeling a deep aversion to her own social class and her cold, calculating nature. She knew that by fighting for Rosa, she was fighting for Emily's happiness, and in a strange way, for her own redemption as a human being. The fight would be long and painful, but the decision was made. The external threat forced the two women into a loving alliance, with Isabella using her influence and money to hire the best lawyers, and Rosa using her quiet strength and love to keep Emily's peace. The nursery, once a stage for despair, now became the headquarters of a legal battle, with documents scattered and defense plans being drawn up in secret. Night fell over Dallas, and fear hung in the mansion. But for the first time, Isabella and Rosa felt like a family, united by the impending danger. Rosa cradled Emily with her nanny as always, and Isabella watched, feeling a love that was composed of pain and admiration. Realizing that the presence of her biological mother was the only thing that kept her daughter safe from the cold and inhumane system that surrounded them. The morning brought with it the inevitable arrival of social services officers, 2 men and a woman with stern faces and thick folders, transforming Emily's nursery into a makeshift courtroom, a place where the cold law collided with the warmth of maternal instinct. The room, with its teddy bears and pastel colors, became the stage for a brutal and inhumane interrogation, where Emily's innocence was the subject of legal dispute. Isabella and Rosa sat side by side, united, but each fearful of losing the child for different reasons. The technical reports were read aloud, describing the instability of the home and the failure of the primary bond, terms that dehumanized Isabella's relationship with her daughter and demonized Rosa's love. The accusations were detailed and relentless, focusing on the adoption lie and the presence of a maid with blood ties, interpreting everything as dangerous manipulation. The air was thick with technical terms and veiled accusations of negligence. Isabella, who had always been intimidated by authority, found unexpected strength, answering questions with the dignity of someone defending what was most precious, arguing that Emily's happiness and health should take precedence over any legal protocol. She pointed to the baby, who was smiling at Rosa, and asked the officers if they dared call that scene a risky environment, challenging the coldness of the reports with living evidence of love. The silence that followed was awkward. Rosa, for her part, remained almost completely silent, speaking only when absolutely necessary, her grief contained and dignified, letting her eyes speak the story of her sacrifice and love. Her humble and strong presence contrasted with the power and wealth of the mansion, and the officers, accustomed to dealing with cases of poverty and abandonment, felt uncomfortable before this display of pure motherhood. They saw a woman who had given up, but who was now the only one capable of soothing the child. The emotional hook of that moment was the unspoken question that hung in the air, suspended over the crib. Who really should keep the baby? The mother who gave her a luxurious home and tried to love her through grief, or the mother who gave her life and peace with a simple song? The law struggled to decide between legal ownership and biological and emotional connection, and Emily was the prize at the center of a struggle of classes and cultures. The nursery, with its colorful toys, was proof of the life that awaited Emily. But the fear that the system would take the child away was palpable, transforming the space into a silent torture chamber for the two mothers. Isabella looked at Rosa and saw not a rival, but an essential ally, the only person who could give Emily the peace she deserved, and the determination to protect her solidified in her heart. Amidst the deafening chaos and despair that consumed the room, Emily, her face flushed and her lips trembling, reached out toward Rosa with incredible strength, a gesture of supplication that demanded recognition and rescue. The baby's blue eyes, brimming with tears, met Rosa's dark maternal ones, and in that moment of absolute connection, the child summoned all her life force for one last effort. Silence fell in the room like reverse thunder, sudden and absolute, as Emily's tiny lower lip trembled, and through the pain and the crying, a syllable was forced out, a small word, but with the weight of a declaration. "Ma! Ma!" The sound was slurred and imperfect, but the meaning was unmistakable. Emily's first word, uttered at the most critical moment of her life, an irrefutable and public choice. The entire room froze, shock taking the breath away from everyone present, from the cynical officers to the protocol therapist who saw her theory of learned behavior crumble in the face of a pure act of communication. Emily's word wasn't just a sound, it was a decision, a living testament to who she recognized as her mother in that moment of despair. The silence that followed that word was more eloquent than any legal argument. Isabella, her heart in tatters and her eyes clouded with tears, felt a profound and liberating surrender, realizing that her struggle had ended there, not in defeat, but in a new form of victory, the victory of Emily's happiness. She looked at Rosa, who wept silently, and at her daughter, who still held out her arms, and, in an act of pure and selfless love, made the decision that would change their lives forever. Isabella walked to Rosa, and with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 6 months of pain, handed Emily into her biological mother's arms, a gesture of surrender and recognition that went beyond possession and legal title. "She chose," Isabella whispered, her voice choked with emotion, but firm in her conviction, accepting the truth that her daughter's instinct had revealed to all. As soon as she felt Rosa's warmth and scent, Emily's crying stopped, as if it had never happened. The baby's face calmed with profound relief, and she smiled. A genuine, radiant smile, nestling into her birth mother's lap. That smile, the end of her crying, was the final proof that the word "mama" had been addressed to the right woman, a heartbreaking moment that sealed the fate of the two families in an unexpected union. Isabella took a step back, letting the warmth of Rosa's lap envelop Emily, feeling the pain of renunciation, but also the peace of having done the right thing, the pain of accepting that biological love had prevailed over legal love. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of grief or frustration, but of a strange and unexpected form of recognition, the certainty that her daughter's happiness could not be bought or forced. She realized that the true act of maternal love was to surrender her ego in favor of the child's needs. Silence fell over the officers and the therapist, who watched the scene with the bewilderment of someone who sees the law defeated by emotion, seeing living proof that instinctive love was stronger than any protocol. Isabella then composed herself, wiped away her tears, and looked at the officers with a dignity that emanated not from her wealth, but from her new and profound understanding of motherhood, a woman transformed by her daughter's unconditional love. In a firm, clear voice that reverberated throughout the playroom, Isabella made the statement that would change the course of that dispute and define the future of that unlikely family. She has two mothers, the one who gave her life and the one who gave her a home. The phrase was an act of reconciliation, a perfect synthesis of that tragedy transformed into a miracle, the acceptance that motherhood was a shared territory. The emotion of the scene was undeniable. The baby, Emily, smiling in Rosa's arms, and Isabella, the legal mother, relinquishing her exclusive rights for the sake of the child's well-being. The officials recoiled, realizing this wasn't a case of neglect or kidnapping, but a situation of complex and unexpected love, where the child had made her own unquestionable choice. They knew no court would dare overturn such a clear and emotional decision. Dr. Reed, the therapist, tried to argue one last time, but her voice faltered, and she looked at Emily's smile, acknowledging the defeat of her theory in the face of the reality of instinct. Emily's fate was sealed there, in that room, under the gaze of the two women who would become her mothers, united by tragedy and a startling revelation. Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the guilt of grief and maternal inadequacy replaced by the lightness of having accepted the truth. She knew the legal battle would still continue to formalize the new dynamic, but Emily's heart had already chosen, and that was what truly mattered. The war was over, and peace had been brokered with one small word: Mama. Months passed, and the Dallas mansion, once a monument to silence and pain, transformed into a vibrant new home, filled with laughter and color. The garden, once immaculate and barren, was now filled with colorful toys and unruly flowers. The house breathed the presence of Emily, who had grown healthy and happy, and, more importantly, the presence of Rosa, no longer a maid, but a co-mother, an indispensable figure in their lives. The transformation was visible in every corner of the house. Rosa and Isabella had found a rhythm of coexistence and shared motherhood that was strangely fluid and functional, dividing the tasks without rivalry, each contributing what they had best for Emily's growth. Isabella provided stability, resources, and structure, while Rosa brought warmth, affection, and pineapple, and the instinctive connection Emily so desperately needed, forming a union of classes and cultures around the love of the child. They were mother and mommy, and Emily knew no other form of family. Emily, freed from the trauma of incessant crying, was a happy and curious baby, crawling around the house with contagious energy, her blue eyes observing the world with the trust of someone deeply loved by two very different but equally devoted women. The legal process had been long and complex, but the court, moved by Isabella's statement and the evidence of Emily's bond with Rosa, had formalized a unique and unprecedented shared custody arrangement. The mansion's wealth finally found its purpose, not as a barrier, but as the stage for a story of redemption and unity, where money served love, not the other way around. Isabella used her influence to help Rosa bring her family to Dallas, providing them with security and stability, while Rosa taught Isabella to connect with the simplicity and tenderness that the life of luxury had stolen. The two women shared a crib at night, shared baths and games, and the friendship born of conflict was stronger than any blood bond, a sisterhood of mothers united by Emily's faith. The rival had become the essential partner, and Isabella's life, once lonely and empty, was now full and purposeful. Dallas's home, once a symbol of emotional emptiness, was now the refuge of a modern and unlikely family, proof that love can rewrite the rules of fate and society. Emily grew up surrounded by lullabies in Spanish and English, a living testament to the union of two cultures, happy and safe in the arms of her two mothers. Emily, now almost 2 years old, staggered through the rose garden, laughing and exploring the world with the dexterity of someone who feels safe, her blonde hair blowing in the warm wind of a Dallas spring afternoon. The garden, which the gardener had kept impeccably, was now filled with small imperfections and marks of childhood exploration, a sign that life had finally triumphed over the rigid and sterile order of the past. The girl stopped in front of a flower bed, her eyes fixed on a white rose, the purest and most immaculate of all, and, with the determined strength of a child, plucked the flower, bringing it to her body with the satisfaction of a momentous achievement. The sweet, soft scent of the rose seemed to blend with the scent of wet earth and fresh grass that Rosa had planted in the garden, a perfect synesthesia of the family's unity. Emily ran toward the terrace, where Isabella and Rosa sat side by side, drinking coffee and reviewing the day's plans, two mothers united in a quiet, complicit conversation, their former rivalry completely forgotten. The girl stopped between the two women, looking at the white flower in her hand and the two faces that loved her unconditionally, and then, with a slow, precise movement, tore the rose in half. With a piece of the flower in each hand, Emily extended the first to Rosa and the second to Isabella, a divided and balanced gift that spoke of a childlike wisdom that transcended adult and legal logic. She looked at both mothers, who were moved by the simple gesture, and declared with the innocence and clarity of her first words, "For my mamas." The ending was living proof that the child had found her own definition of family. Tears and laughter mingled on the faces of Isabella and Rosa, who embraced over Emily's head, united by the broken rose, a symbol that the child's life had been divided between them, but that division had multiplied their love. Life had taught them that sacrifice and surrender were, in fact, the greatest acts of motherhood, and that happiness knew no boundaries of class or culture. The sun began to set over the mansion, bathing the terrace in a soft golden light, and Rosa whispered one last nana as Isabella rocked Emily to the rhythm of the song, the perfect union of two languages and two hearts. The final scene was one of peace and fulfillment, the resolution of a conflict that had threatened to destroy them, but which, in the end, had united them indestructibly. Blood gives life, but it is love that makes it blossom. If this story of redemption and maternal connection resonated with you, if you believe in the power of love that transcends borders and documents, subscribe to the channel and follow this journey. Leave a comment and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that true home is where the heart finds peace. Remember, fate often places us on unlikely paths, forcing us to surrender our ego to embrace a greater love. Don't get caught up in titles or expectations. Dare to love in a complex and courageous way. Your greatest strength lies in your ability to recognize the greater good, even if it comes from an unexpected source.